Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our series on the War of 1812 and masculinity. My name is Adrienne Briggs, and I am assistant curator here at the museum. Before we get too far into the night, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement, and then I will do a quick introduction on our speaker, and then I will hand it over. The Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinootan peoples. The Chinootan peoples have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. So tonight we will be listening to Kaitlyn Carter. She is going to be presenting her talk on the myth of medical bravery, pain, masculinity, and nationalism in the War of 1812. Kaitlyn has a BA and MA and is researching emotions generated by encounters between the British military and colonial populations in romantic conflict. As I said, this is talk 2 of 3, so tune in next week for our final talk. And please do post any questions you have in the chat through Zoom or on Facebook in the comments, as I will be monitoring them throughout the evening. So if there's any questions for Kaitlyn, as we will be having a Q&A at the end of the night. Please sit back and listen, and I'm going to hand it over to Kaitlyn for the evening's talk.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. Okay. So hopefully you can all see that. So first, I'd like to thank Adrienne for introducing me. I'm honored to be here today to speak with you on a topic that I have been researching since January of 2019. But before I begin, I would like to extend my sincerest thank you to the Niagara Falls Museum, to my fellow speakers in this series, Jake Bredman and Melissa Fowler, as well as the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine and Associated Medical Services. This research was generously funded by a Hannah Summer studentship that allowed me to travel to the UK in July of 2019. I'd also like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Renee Lafferty-Sohani and Dr. Dan Malik of Brock University. So without further ado, I am thrilled to present the myth of medical bravery, pain, masculinity, and nationalism in the War of 1812. I'd also like to do a little bit of a caveat for a few things. The first is that I have a cat who lives with me who is very insistent, so if he makes a guest appearance, I apologize in advance for that. And also, I'd like to provide a little bit of a content warning that I do have some medical images in this slideshow, which may be considered graphic. So if you are uncomfortable with that, I would recommend maybe just listening instead of watching the presentation as well. All right, wonderful. So I'm happy to get started. Now, when the War of 1812 concluded in the spring of 1815, some 30,000 casualties had been suffered by the two opposing armies. Now, this number can often seem dwarfed by the much larger statistics that emerge from the simultaneous peninsular wars, or in the memory of many North Americans, the much more violent and destructive First World War that would follow only a century later. Yet this brief, relatively understudied war, at least outside of Niagara, has become synonymous with expressions of nationalism in both America and Canada. For the United States, the bombardment of Fort McHenry and its bombs bursting in air gave birth to their national anthem. And for Canadians who gained independence from Britain 52 years after the Treaty of Ghent, the War of 1812 became a rallying point to define their young nation and to shape a new Canadian identity. A narrative began to shape around the War of 1812, one that emerged as a story of retaliation, defense, loyalty, and ultimately sacrifice for two young nations. Now, sacrifice fundamentally becomes a vehicle for people to reflect upon the cost of war, and nationalism becomes a valid excuse for this cost. I think we can all agree that it is far more noble to die for the idea of a nation than it is to die for a game of political intrigue. And this narrative of sacrifice being a paramount feature of nationalistic expression is not a modern invention, but rather is demonstrated throughout military history quite prominently. Whereas in the past, before the modern concept of nation states emerged, one might project these feelings onto their lord or king. By 1812, the British Army was certainly dying for king and for country. Indeed, in the early 19th century, men's desires to tie nationalistic value to their sacrifice in the form of bodily injury completely transformed the ways men interacted with their medical care. Furthermore, as physicality is intimately connected with the 19th century's ideas of masculinity and purpose, the way men interacted with their bodies and injuries that damaged their bodies is emblematic of how they interact with their gender and their gender's role in maintaining their nation. So above all, expressions and experiences of pain, a potent physical experience, define not only a man's masculinity, but also his willingness to suffer for a cause. And if one considers the relationship between masculine ideals and nationalism, pain further defines a man's willingness to suffer for his nation and its ideals. Therefore, expression of pain becomes in itself a performance of masculinity and ultimately an expression of nationalism. Now, this presentation intends to explore the relationship between pain, performance, masculinity, and how these three features interact to constitute an act of nationalism in the British Army in the early 19th century. But before we can get to this performance of pain, we must address what medical treatment actually looked like at the dawn of 1812. Although I hazard to use this word, medicine around the War of 1812 was by many of our modern standards somewhat barbaric. But much of that perception comes from cinematic representations of battlefield medicine. I tend to think of that scene from Gone with the Wind, where that man is having his leg amputated and he's screaming in pain and writhing in agony and in shadow while Scarlett looks on just absolutely horrified. That is a scene which I will admit gave me nightmares as a child after watching the movie with my mother. And I'm sure that that child looking on now would be shocked by what my area of expertise is and academic interest. But despite these, dare I say, romantic representations of battlefield injury, military medicine did not revolve around dramatic surgeries taking place in the aftermath of battle, although that will be a major focus of this presentation. Rather, preventative medicine and treating diseases in the troops, particularly on foreign campaigns, was arguably the most important part of the regimental physician's work. The treatment of diseases proved to be an enormous task, especially considering, as Matthew H. Kaufman cites, quote, "It was not unusual for 20 or 30 or occasionally 40% of an army to be incapacitated or hospitalized at any one time," end quote. Now, as germ theory would not be formally discovered by Louis Pasteur until the 1860s, physicians and surgeons at the beginning of the 19th century relied primarily on the theory of miasma or bad air. This is a theory of poisoned or infected atmosphere surrounding the sick, which did lead to successful developments in quarantine when resources were available to medical practitioners, but resulted in absolutely catastrophic levels of infection within patients. Particularly in the aftermath of battles, army surgeons would be struggling to treat mass casualties, and they would not have time to wash their tools between patients, let alone disinfect them if that had even been a common practice at the time, which it wasn't. As a result, injured men would be exposed to the bodily fluids and germs of other soldiers, making them far more prone to infection. The surgeons and physicians tasked with managing casualties were continuously fighting a losing battle against death. Now, wounded men would often be left on the battlefield for days or even weeks, laying in agony before they would see any form of treatment. In one particularly dreadful case in Europe, Dr. Charles Bell recalls men still being pulled from the field more than 2 weeks after the Battle of Waterloo, many crying out for two things: water and mercy. Though the field ambulance was invented and brought into consistent use by French physician Dominique Chanlery during the Napoleonic Wars, transporting injured men remained a painful and difficult task. Additionally, the difficult terrain in North America, particularly Niagara, made Larry's ambulance ineffective and unusable. Transporting men to field hospitals was only the beginning of the challenge of managing mass casualties for physicians. One of the most prominent issues that faced physicians in the first half of the 19th century was the lack of any available anesthesia. Ether anesthesia would not be invented until 1846 and would not be seen in a military setting until the Crimean War in 1853. Prior to the introduction of chemicals like ether and chloroform, surgeons in 1812 resorted to mind-numbing doses of either alcohol or opium if it was available for their use, but Niagara was woefully undersupplied. And oftentimes, if pain relief was available, it was reserved only for the officer classes, as the British military deferred heavily to their class-based rank system. Now, through understanding these unique features of military medicine in 1812, it becomes startlingly clear that military medicine lagged behind the treatment that was available to civilians. The first Director General of the Royal Army Medical Corps, James McGregor, wrote that, quote, "The soldier should not be consigned to the ignorant and uneducated of the profession. He is clearly entitled to the same quality of medical advice as when he was a civilian," end quote. However, it was difficult to attract qualified physicians to the military. Military medicine, despite providing the most practical training experience to young physicians, was still considered a lower form of the practice of medicine. Many physicians enlisted young, just fresh out of university, only in order to gain employment and practical experience with tropical diseases and these more gruesome injuries before returning to England to open a private civilian practice. So in many ways, I guess you could say that the Army was the residency of its time for young doctors. Now, regardless of this bias against military physicians, medical figures who had valuable knowledge gained from working on soldiers would go on to publish numerous volumes of work that would influence medicine well into the rest of the 19th century. Most prominently, figures like James Mann, James McGregor, John Pringle, William Tiger Dunlop, Dominique Jean Larrey, and George James Guthrie all emerged from a military background. Increased militarism in British culture in the early 19th century led to a growing fascination amongst the British public with military figures like Horatio Nelson and the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wesley. Now, this interest also extended to military surgeons, especially after April of 1812, when Wellington became the first British officer to praise army doctors for their efforts after the siege of Badajoz. Now, through this credit, Wellington effectively redefined the role of the British military surgeon in Britain's war efforts, and in doing so, have made them invaluable to the British public's perception and understanding of war. Now, British understanding of men's place in war is also facing an early transition in the early 19th century, as what it means to be masculine was actively being redefined. The War of 1812 finds itself in this transitionary period in terms of public understanding of masculinity and the ways in which masculinity was expected to be performed. Now, going back a little bit, in 1771, an influential book called The Man of Feeling was published. Written by Henry Mackenzie, The Man of Feeling became a sensation and redefined what was considered proper expression of masculinity. The protagonist of the novel, Harley, frequently emotes dramatically and sheds numerous tears in order to express his internal suffering. Now, in one particularly poignant scene, Harley even converts a military officer, the image of hypermasculinity, to his more sensitive ways of expression, as you can see here in this woodcut. Now, upon Harley's encouragement, the soldier, quote, laid his left hand on his heart, the sword dropped from his right, he burst into tears, end quote. The image of a soldier rejecting his sword, a physical symbol of militarism and masculinity, in favor of sympathy and emotion, became emblematic of sensibility and the civilized man that was so prominent in the 18th century. Nevertheless, by 1820, this perception of masculinity had changed drastically. Public displays of men's tears became problematic and a symptom of femininity. Sensibility and masculinity were entirely incompatible, much in the same way that men and women came to be considered entirely opposed. 1812 finds itself in a strange middle ground of this transitionary period. Many men ascribed to the new beliefs of rigid expressions of masculinity, while still allowing these emotional moments to come through at appropriate or overwhelming moments, such as medical treatment after battle. However, this emotion still needed to be performed in the correct way to be considered appropriate for a man, and more than that, for a British man. Now, if you were able to attend last week's talk with Jake Bredman, then you might have noticed that Jake touched on the idea of a correct performance of emotion and how men were expected to showcase this emotional restraint. This desire for emotional restraint became heightened in the emotional community that was created by the British Army. But what is an emotional community? Now, in their 2018 monograph, Barbara Rosenwein and Riccardo Cristiani proposed the important concept of emotional community, which is comprised of, quote, groups of people who share the same or similar valuations of particular emotions, goals, and norms of expression, end quote. So this idea of emotional community is crucial to understanding surgeons' work in the aftermath of battle during the War of 1812. For their writings and artworks are just as much a product of their interaction with the emotional communities of the British Army and American armies, as it is a consequence of their own personal understanding of emotionality. But how do we define the emotional community of armies in the 19th century? A generalized concept of the way that men interacted within the British Army will never provide a wholly complete understanding of how men experienced the War of 1812. However, what this generalization allows is a portrait of what the accepted expression of emotion was in the context of military culture. In this way, studying how soldiers interacted with each other in high stress scenarios, including medical treatment after battle, becomes a foundation for understanding the emotional community that existed in the British Army at the turn of the century. Now, by the early 19th century, men fully ascribed to their biological difference from and superiority to women. Now, considering that gender became so deeply rooted in nature at the end of the 18th century, the physical body became the primary way to conceptualize gender and to express masculinity and femininity as uniquely different. Therefore, the way that men interacted with pain and how they expressed it also became a matter of how they interacted with their masculinity and emotion. In the context of the British Army, this emotional performance became explicitly tied to how they presented their nationhood as well. Now, identity in the 19th century was shaped by a person's relationship to their surroundings. So men were defined by their work, religion, family, race, and their nationhood. Nationhood and loyalty to one's nation became increasingly important in the context of war, especially when two countries such as France or England, or Canada and the United States, had populations that physically looked very similar. In fact, throughout the 19th century, and arguably even today, a young Canada and a young United States, nationalism became defined by what a country was not rather than what it was. So anti-American sentiment became a chronicle of the many ways that British and eventually Canadian culture was superior. It was more sophisticated, civilized, and above all else, more rational. So the concept of Britain as a rational nation, one that defied the 18th century's man of feeling, is exemplified in one story emerging from the Napoleonic Wars. After the Battle of Waterloo, Edward Costello of the 95th Rifles witnessed the medical efforts of British doctors. Though he admitted that the French were brave in battle, they lacked the quote unquote cool, unflinching spirit of British soldiers when facing surgery. So I do have a section of Costello's memoir here that I think warrants reading in full. And that is, quote, an English soldier, evidently an old weather-beaten warfarer, while undergoing the amputation of an arm below the elbow, held the injured limb with his other hand without betraying the slightest emotion. Near to him was a Frenchman, bellowing lustily, while a surgeon was probing for a ball near the shoulder. This seemed to annoy the Englishman more than anything else, and so much so that as soon as his arm was amputated, he struck the Frenchman a smart blow across the breech with the severed limb, holding it at the wrist, saying, here, take that and stuff it down your throat and stop your damned bellowing, end quote. Now, this tale evidently paints a portrait where the emotionless English soldier is superior to, and indeed more desirable than, a bellowing Frenchman who openly and femininely wept, displaying his suffering and pain to all those that surrounded him. Now, physicality, masculinity, and nationalism were indeed extremely intertwined in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In his article, Zebulon Pike and His Frozen Lads, Bodies, Nationalism, and the West in the Early Republic, by historian Jared Orsi, which is a fantastic article, and you have not read it, I highly recommend it, in which Orsi details the experience of Zebulon Pike and his crew during an American military expedition to explore the Rocky Mountains after the Louisiana Purchase. During the course of this expedition, Pike left 2 men in his crew who had suffered severe frostbite on their feet and could no longer travel behind. Now, he did promise to return for them when he could. However, leaving these men behind was a difficult choice for Pike. But as Orsi notes, quote, Pike viewed the lost toes as a sacrifice for a grateful nation. The men owed their bodies to their nation, and the nation owed them gratitude, end quote. Pike's expedition took place in 1807, only 5 years before the start of the War of 1812. And as such, it is evident that this attitude, one that suggested men owed their body to the nation, translated strongly into the conflict. But what it also suggests is that there exists a type of contract between the British public, the British government, and its soldiers. Now, there are, of course, literal contracts involved with military service, but what I refer to is an unspoken one. It is the idea that heroism that is often generously bestowed upon the military is purchased at the expense of men's bodily and mental suffering. Soldiers pay for their patriotism with pain and are rewarded with the title of hero. This metaphorical contract romanticizes the expectation of sacrifice to the point that it no longer becomes a tragedy, but rather is simply a fulfillment of masculine duty. Now, men viewed their own bodies as collateral for their nation's security. And for instance, we can turn to Shadrach Byfield. Shadrach Byfield was a private in the 41st Regiment of Foot who found himself gravely wounded in the aftermath of the Battle of Frenchtown in January of 1813. Byfield expressed concern that he might be dead and worried excessively about his bleeding until the doctor, quote, soon returned saying, my dear fellows, we have taken all of them, being the Americans, prisoners. At which news he exclaimed, being quite overjoyed, I don't mind about my wound, since that is the case, end quote. In an episode of deep nationalism and joy, Byfield found that his pain and suffering was inferior to the news that the British had won the battle, and his own injuries were a worthy cost to securing a British victory against the Americans early in the war. Now, Byfield's loyalty to the crown would be tested again at the Battle of Conjecta Creek on the 21st of September, 1814, when his lower left arm was shattered by a musket ball and had to be amputated. In almost downplaying the trauma that he faced in his surgery without any pain relief, Byfield later recalled that the medical team, quote, prepared to blind me and had meant to hold me, but I told them there was no need of that. The operation was tedious and painful, but I was enabled to bear it pretty well, end quote. Through facing his amputation without any pain relief or restraint, Byfield proved he was rational, unfeeling, and ultimately masculine. In fact, he refers rather nonchalantly to his amputation, stating that he was quickly able to return to the masculine pastimes as, quote, the stump of my arm soon healed, and 3 days after, I was able to play a game of fives for a quart of rum. So he was up and playing cards with the boys. Now, throughout the remainder of Byfield's memoir, despite issues with receiving a veteran's pension and lack of work available for disabled soldiers, he shows little to no resentment towards the British government for the loss of his limb in what could be considered a senseless war. That is not to say that Byfield did not experience a great trauma or recognize that he was experiencing trauma. In one unique episode from the War of 1812, Byfield, upon, quote, being informed that the orderly had thrown his hand to the dung heap, he arose, went to find him, and felt a disposition to strike him, end quote. So, not wanting to see his arm thrown out as though it were trash, Byfield hosted a small funeral for his severed limb and buried it in a rampart in a small makeshift coffin, actually at Fort Niagara. Although I don't know if they know where Byfield's arm is. So if you visit the fort, please don't ask them where it is and don't tell them that Kaitlyn sent you to find it. I don't know if they would like that. But what is evident here is that Byfield felt the emotional and physical loss of his arm quite keenly, and yet also felt that outwardly expressing this pain, whether through tears or more effeminate emotions, would call into question his masculinity and ultimately his place within the British Army. I'm just going to take a second to take a drink here. Okay. It is not just patients who felt the tense emotional environment that surrounded medical treatments in the aftermath of battle. Upon arriving in Waterloo in July of 1815, 2 weeks after the Battle of Waterloo had taken place, Charles Bell recounted to his brother that, quote, it is impossible to convey to you the picture of human misery continuously before my eyes. What was heart-rendering in the day was intolerable at night, end quote. Bell's acute awareness of the ways in which the Battle of Waterloo was being appropriated to create a pro-British and nationalistic narrative in England comes through distinctly in his letters home to his brother, George Joseph Bell. In a letter, he wrote that, quote, after being 8 days among the wounded, I visited the field of battle. The view of the field, the gallant stories, the charges, the individual instances of enterprise and valor recalled to me the sense the world has of victory and Waterloo. But this is transient. A gloomy, uncomfortable view of human nature is the inevitable consequence of looking upon the whole as I did, as I was forced to do. It is a misfortune to have our sentiments so at variance with the universal impression, but there must ever be associated with the honors of Waterloo, to my eyes, the most shocking sights of woe, to my ear, accents of entreaty, outcry from the manly breasts, interrupted forcible expressions of the dying, and noisome smells, end quote. This emotional passage reveals the deep misunderstanding that the British public had with the valor and nobility of battle. Bell understood and was forced to look upon the grim and gruesome reality of that nationalism. Along with soldiers like Shadrach Byfield, Bell had an intimate view of the incredibly high cost of military conquest and connected that with the cost of British nationalism. Bell later excused the effeminate expression of emotion that he wrote into this particular letter, stating that the amount of work he was doing, quote, may convey an excuse for this excess of sentiment, end quote. While men might be willing to express emotion in connection to their pain, be it physical or mental, for a short period of time, it is either excused, as in the case of Bell, or done in an appropriately masculine fashion, such as in the case of Byfield, who reacted in anger to the trauma of his arm being thrown into a waste pit before its burial. Though surgeons acknowledge the difficult emotions that come in the face of trauma after battle, many felt that this emotional cost was worth it in order to secure national safety. James Mann, an American military physician, even felt that nationalism was a prominent motivator for soldiers who often faced repeated mental and physical trauma and lived in conditions that would be considered harsh by contemporary standards. In his reflection on the War of 1812, Mann wrote that, quote, familiar with death, the soldier soon forgets that the feeling of horror was once attached to its name. The love of country, honor, the pride of conquest incite him to acts of heroism. When duty calls to confront the enemy, he obeys the summons with the same electricity as when invited by the alluring voice of pleasure to his amusements, end quote. It is evident that in Mann's consideration, death and grave injury became a risk soldiers were willing to accept in order to properly express their loyalty to their nation. And if they did not express this level of nationalism, their purpose, and by extension, their masculinity, would be called into question. Physicians and surgeons could expect to see the pain of their patients play out in similar fashion. Some men would scream and thrash, while others would calmly accept their surgery, typically in order to earn manly clout amongst the rest of their regiment. However, medical personnel, similar to the everyday soldier, also expressed their masculinity through their resistance to pain. In the epilogue of James McGregor's autobiography, it is attributed that, quote, few men had seen pain, disease, and death under more violent and hideous aspects than Sir James McGregor, end quote. And in a testament to maintaining his strong and noble character, McGregor is also described as, quote, passing without pain, end quote. Once again, reinforcing the idea that pain, while being a physical experience that nearly every human shares, is something that is not connected to the legacy of great national British figures like McGregor. But did surgeons have a different understanding of pain than civilians and soldiers? Medicine and the role of the surgeon was one that could provide soldiers with a sense of comfort in their last moments or a sense of hope that they could survive. Surgeons faced numerous challenges and all approached medicine in different ways, with different backgrounds and with different training. Yet nearly every surgeon writes of one treatment that they could provide to their patients at no personal cost, and that is compassion. Compassion for their suffering and allowing men to express their emotions and grieve became a part of the job of the regimental surgeon. Though we have come a long way in recognizing the causes and effects of mental trauma like PTSD, there does exist some evidence of this trauma in 1812, although we would hazard to call it that since PTSD as we know it doesn't exist until 1980. So though it may not be recognized by civilians who only saw the glory of military victory, surgeons dealing with the horrific aftermath of battle saw these emotions and coped with them as best as possible. In regards to pain, surgeon John Hennon wrote that, quote, injuries can be soon relieved by a mouthful of wine or spirits or by an opioid, but above all, by the tenderness and sympathizing manner of the surgeon and his assurance of the patient's safety, end quote. This is undoubtedly a call for empathy in treating soldiers' wounds, a sentiment shared by Sir Charles Bell, who routinely expressed sympathy for the patients he was treating, and even went so far as to write of his personal practice. Sorry, apologies for that. I hope you can still hear me. Even went so far to write of his personal practice that his patients, quote, come for my character and are retained by finding relief, by being treated with attention and kindness, end quote. There is a simple expectation of humanity behind this sentiment, one that we can assume drove Bell and other surgeons in the 19th century's methods for understanding and treating patients. Above all, it depends on the kindness and human capacity for empathy. Now, looking towards how this empathy could still be considered masculine, William Tiger Dunlop's recollection of the American War of 1812 to 1814, which reads far more as an adventure novel than it does a medical record, is a perfect example. In his book, Dunlop recounts an episode in which he suddenly, quote, felt a severe sharp pain from my brow to the back of my head. At the same moment, the colonel exclaimed, by God, you are shot through the head. I sunk upon one knee and taking off my forage cap, felt along my head for blood, but none was to be found. It is only a graze, said I, end quote. But why would Dunlop choose to include this in what is essentially a medical record? Well, in order for Dunlop's character to seem noble and heroic, it is crucial that he undergoes a physical challenge, and more importantly, masculinely rises to this physical trial for king and country. In one other trial faced by Dunlop was the work that was required of him in treating the mass casualties. After the Battle of Lundy's Lane, Dunlop, who had arrived in Niagara only that day, was responsible for more than 220 wounded men, with no assistance but his hospital sergeant. Dunlop admits that he found this responsibility overwhelming, writing in his memoir that, quote, the charge was too much for us, and many a poor fellow had to submit to an amputation whose limb might have been preserved had there been only time to take reasonable care of it. But under the circumstances of the case, it was necessary to convert a troublesome wound into a simple one, or to lose the patient's life from want of time to pay him proper attention, end quote. Dunlop's own exhaustion in treating over 200 patients with little to no support was recorded in his memoir, as he recollected that, quote, I never underwent such fatigue. I'm going to start that quote over. I never underwent such fatigue as I did for the first week at Butler's Barracks. For 2 days and 2 nights, I never sat down. On the morning of the third day, however, I fell asleep on my feet with my arm embracing the post of one of the berths. It was found impossible to awaken me, end quote. The lack of assistance grated on Dunlop, who sufficiently summarized this particular trouble as, quote, one of the many blunders of this blundering war was that the staff of the army was never where it was wanted, end quote. In contrast to Charles Bell, a more sensitive and emotional figure from early 19th century medicine, William Dunlop's recollection offers a unique view into how a hyper-masculine figure interacted with the emotional conditions surrounding battlefield medicine. In his recount of the Battle of Lundy's Lane, still accredited as Canada's bloodiest battle, Dunlop offers an extraordinary insight into the mental strain that accompanied the taxing job of a military physician, and I believe this passage warrants repeating in full. Dunlop wrote, quote, there is hardly on the face of the earth a less enviable situation than that of an army surgeon after battle. Worn out and fatigued in body and mind, surrounded by suffering, pain, and misery, much of which he knows it is not in his power to heal or even to assuage. When the battle lasts, these all pass unnoticed, but they come before the medical man afterwards in all their sorrow and horror, stripped of all the excitement of the heaty fight. It would be a useful lesson to cold-blooded politicians who calculate on a war costing so many lives and so many limbs as they would calculate on a horse costing so many pounds, or to the thoughtless at home, to whom the excitement of a gazette or the glare of an illumination more than reconciles the expense of a war, to witness such a scene, if only for an hour. In a rare bout of sincerity, Dunlop addresses the difficulty in treating hundreds of dying men and attempting to put a stop to death. The remainder of his book offers little comment on the medical practices of the War of 1812, instead focusing on more masculine and popular hobbies that come with traveling. And as I quoted earlier, the one time he was shot at for some reason. With Dunlop's rather reserved focus, it is not surprising that the most sincere and emotionally charged line of his book is accredited to a war widow. Only she, in her femininity, is allowed to question the validity of suffering for nationalism. Now, after the Battle of Lundy's Lane, an elderly gentleman is injured. He's shot in the torso, and there's nothing Dunlop can do for him but make him comfortable. He's brought to him at Butler's Barracks, and it takes some time, but this woman does show up. His wife shows up, and she sits in the ground with her husband's head in her lap and waits for him to pass. And when he finally does, she cries out, quote, "Oh, that the king and president were both here this moment to see the misery their quarrels lead to. They surely would never go to war without a cause that they could give as a reason to God at the last day for thus destroying the creatures that he hath made in his own image," end quote. And I believe that it is this line that defines the War of 1812, and it is this woman. It's not patriotic songs about maple leafs or star-spangled banners, but real people who lost limbs, lives, and loved ones to a destructive and ultimately unnecessary war. At the very beginning of my talk, I threw a statistic at you. I said there are 30,000 casualties. But I'd like to remind you that in the greater context of things, those are 30,000 people, 30,000 lives. They had names, they had loved ones, they had hopes and dreams, and their lives were permanently changed by this war. The 19th century is an era where masculinity and nationalism became increasingly connected to embodied and physical expressions. Emotionality was replaced with rationality, and men became increasingly encouraged to act outwardly indifferent to their lives and the state of their bodies. It is in this transitionary period between the feeling and the rational that the War of 1812 finds its emotional legacy. Increasing militarism led to increasing demands for a masculine and nationalistic population. And medicine importantly became a means through which to respond to and express these demands. As physical sacrifice became demanded as an ultimate sign of national loyalty, how men interacted with this demand defined the ways in which they interacted with their nation. Conclusively, expression and performance of pain became an act of nationalism in itself, and shaped how men who underwent traumatic medical experiences related to their nation and their personal role in it. All right, thank you so much for your time, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. All right, I'll stop sharing. Okay, perfect.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. That was a great talk, Kaitlyn. So we have a few questions. So starting with the first one, you specifically address pain in this talk by offering how controlling the emotions generated in medical treatment become loaded with masculinity. Are there any other emotions you think specifically relate to nationalism?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. There are a few that I think kind of overlap with this expression of pain, because expression of pain in itself is kind of an expression of a variety of different emotions. And so one of those emotions I would definitely say is fear. It's the idea that men need to conquer fear and need to be, courageous and brave and stoically, charging ahead. And I think when we think of linear war tactics, like what are fought in the War of 1812, we think, they're crazy to stand there and get shot at, but let's also consider the amount of mental training that would have to go behind being willing to stand there and be shot at, the amount that you would have to kind of rewire your brain to even let that happen. And so I think fear is a really large one. I think expression of romance and love is one, and evidently sadness as well, since we do see kind of restrictions placed on when and how men cry. And that's, one that we see kind of throughout history. And now, you're taught boys don't cry. Well, why is that? And how does that relate to masculinity? And in the case of a weeping soldier, such as the Frenchman, as Costello recounted, is that an embarrassment to his nation? So I think those are kind of all different emotions that we see playing out here.
That's a very good answer. I have a question from Jake. He says, amazing talk. In your research, did you come across accounts of Indigenous warriors' experience or of surgery or medical treatment?
That's a fantastic question. Now, admittedly, I haven't done much with Indigenous medical with the War of 1812 yet. The main reason for that is because most of my research has focused on the Napoleonic Wars, with the War of 1812 kind of considered as an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. But what I have seen so far is that there was kind of a great fear of Indigenous masculinity and the way that they performed it. And so most of the time, you're not seeing British surgeons interact with Indigenous warriors as much. Indigenous warriors tended to kind of seek medical treatment in Indigenous communities. And really kind of the best resource we have for that is John Norton. And John Norton does kind of indicate that they're considered very separate at the time. But that is, again, something that I hope to actually look into when I start my next master's degree. So definitely something I want to be including there.
Okay, good. We have another question from Robin. To Bravo, would you say there is a notable difference between the nationalistic reactions to pain or suffering between the British and Americans, or do they seem to be consistently similar?
That's a really interesting question. And one that I can answer by referring back to that concept of emotional community. Now, looking at the Americans and the British in this period, the British have had a long-standing British army. These are career soldiers, whereas in the War of 1812, a lot of the Americans that are fighting are militiamen. So they're not trained soldiers. They would meet up once or twice a year to fire their rifles and muskets and then drink, pretty much. So they don't have the same amount of training that you see British soldiers having. And that comes out after for example, the aftermath of the Battle of Fort George and the occupation of Fort George, when the Americans abandoned because they're just tired of being there. And so because of the different levels of training that exist between the British Army and the American militia, and then what would eventually become the American Standing Army, they're interacting with it differently because they have different levels of training. So they conceptualize themselves in the nation differently. But we did see that James Mann quote that I shared. James Mann was an American surgeon. So we see him indicating that a lot of that pain, these militiamen were willing to suffer for love of country, and that they respond to the demand for pain the same way that they respond to the desire for pleasure. So, I mean, and again, this war coming so quickly after the Revolutionary War, we're probably also seeing kind of the ripple effects of that extreme nationalism, because we do essentially see American patriots fighting British loyalists again. So I think that's a really interesting question, but what it really kind of comes down to is the fact that we're looking at a trained standing army versus primarily militiamen.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, another question. Why do you think the British Army specifically focused on pain as something that needed to be overcome?
So one of the reasons that I think they specifically focus on pain is because pain is such a universal experience, and it's a universally negative experience. And I think it's also there's going to be a very different conceptualization of pain in 1812 than we have today, because they exist in a world where you can't actively avoid pain. Whereas, today we get a headache, we take an Advil. So we have a different relationship with pain, where nobly enduring pain isn't necessarily the same thing for us, because for us, if you're deciding to endure that pain, it's kind of like, well, why would you do that? We have medicine. They don't have that option in 1812. What's very interesting is there's a social historian, Javier, I can never say his last name, Scocco, I think. And his book is called A Cultural History of Pain. And he argues that pain is a very important social expression because we assign meaning to experiences that can be emulated. So we give significance to things that we can repeat. And military sacrifice and military pain is something that can be emulated by every soldier in the British Army. You can all get shot at a battle and you can all properly respond to it, and we can credit you for that. And so because there's this sense of imitation in the way that soldiers are performing pain, it becomes, you act like your fellow man, your fellow soldier, and it's going to look better. And the other thing too, I think about the specific focus on pain is what I come back to at the idea of deserting, that the Americans were more likely to desert, and that training men to deal with linear war tactics and things like that. If you make responding to pain negatively cowardly, men are less likely to run away, because you're not going to want to face that pain unless they associate kind of a positive outcome with it, in the way that Shadrach Byfield did, right? Where he's saying, you know, I don't mind my pain because we won. So there's positive that's coming out of this negative, because if there's no positive, why on earth would you do it? Why on earth would you why would you go to the battlefield? Why would you let them do that to you? So I think we have to understand, one, that there's a very different relationship to pain, and two, that the mentality that you need to train into a soldier to face these lines of fire, these volleys of fire, is going to dictate how they're relating to it.
That makes sense. I like your last point about you got almost have to brainwash the idea of pain to make it.
It's indoctrination is what it is, right? And a big part of that is making them so loyal to the nation that anything outside of it doesn't exist to them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, another question. Do you think women had a similar relationship to pain and sacrifice during the War of 1812?
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question. Women are notably absent from my research and from my presentation, aren't they? And what part of that is because the British Army in itself is a very masculine environment. It's a hyper-masculine environment, but there were women there. There were soldiers' wives who worked at the barracks. These soldiers' wives would sometimes be appropriated to act as nurses. Nursing isn't really a profession until post-Crimean War with Florence Nightingale. But what we're seeing with women is women in general have a very different relationship to pain than men do. There seems to be this desire to, save women from pain, but at the same time, pain is considered this natural punishment for women in this time period. I'm thinking specifically pain in menstruation and pain in childbirth. It's actually funny that when ether and chloroform are first developed, there's this huge discussion as to whether or not women should have access to it in childbirth, because that's Eve's punishment. Right? So all women are punished for the original sin, because all women are connected to the original sin, because women bad. And really what we're looking at here is that I think women have a different understanding of sacrifice, because they're not the ones that it's demanded of, but they're the ones who feel the echoes of it. So let's look at, like, Laura Secord is a great example. Her husband's injured at, I think it's the Battle of Queenston Heights he's shot at, but I can't be certain about that. But because he's injured, she's the one who has to do the walk, right? That would typically be something you'd expect her husband to do, but she takes that upon herself, and she has to look after these American officers that are occupying her home, because her husband's not able to do it because he made that sacrifice, right? Women are the ones who get left behind. And I think it's so fascinating that the war widow says, oh, that the king and president were here. She specifically notes that. But who is always there? It's women. Women are always present, and women are always kind of on the outside of it. So I think that women have a different relationship with this military sacrifice, because at the end of it, they're the ones who most suffer the ramifications of it, because once a man does it, it's done and he gets the credit, but she has to live with the after effect of it. She has to live with that loss.
I would even argue a lot of those points in some way still stand in today's society.
Yeah,
a few different
completely.
points.
And I mean, that's something that you see kind of going through to the First World War, the Second World War, where women are on the home front, and they're in factories and making these types of sacrifices. And then, men come home from the sacrifice that they made and expect everything to be normal again, because women didn't also have a sacrifice, right? Women go right back to the home, and it's women are expected in some ways to stay more static than men in their place in society. And I think a lot of that kind of comes back to, what do we ask of men, and what do we ask of men's bodies, and how are women supposed to respond to that?
That's a very good point. All right, final question, and that's a note. If anyone else has any other questions, please put them in the chat now so we can get to them before we wrap up. You say that surgeons appear to be the most empathetic military figures. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that kind of circles back to what I was saying about women seeing the echoes of military sacrifice. I think surgeons very much do as well. And I think the best one that I can point towards is Bell and Dunlop, the quotes that I shared there, where Dunlop says, you know, it would do well for politicians to be in a triage tent, to see these men in pain, to see these men suffering. And Bell says that, you know, the Battle of Waterloo, that we think of this as this huge gallant battle, but it's always for him going to be connected to the men he treated and to the injuries that he saw. And so I think that for surgeons, they become very disillusioned with the idea of sacrifice and this idea of noble pain, because to them, they see what happens after that sacrifice. They see the men who are crying out for their mother, and they see you enlisted at the British Army at 16. They see children, right? Who are injured and need treatment, and who did this because this is what they were told to do. And so I think surgeons become a very empathetic figure because they are dealing with all of this suffering. And they realize that you can be harsh and horrible to these men. It's not going to make them easier to treat, or you can just be kind. And I like to think that humanity is good. And I like to think that when humans have the power to choose kindness, they will. And I think surgeons are the best example of that. That being said, there are also soldiers like Edward Costello, who does claim that his surgeon is, what are his words? Untrained, uncouth, and a rogue is how he describes one of them. But for the most part, I found they're relatively positive.
All right, that's good. I like it. I mean, there's no one's happy. You can never please everyone. All right, so I don't think there's any other questions that I can see.
I see one more on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it was Robin's double posted. Got it. Do you know where the stereotype of indifferent trauma surgeon came from? It's referenced quite commonly in the Fort George musket demonstrations.
It's actually interesting that you bring up Fort George, because I worked there for 4 years and I used to do a very shortened version of this kind of talk at Fort George. And that was something that I challenged while I was there, is the idea of surgeons being unfeeling and uncaring, because that's the opposite of the truth. We tend to think of surgeons in this period as very cold and cruel. And I think part of that is because of the way that we view the medical treatment. I said earlier, I hazard to use the word barbaric, but that tends to be the best way for people to understand it, because we see surgeons as, you know, chopping off limbs left, right, and center, and doing these really horrible and painful surgeries without anesthesia. But I think what we need to remember when we look at these surgeons, and I quote Dr. Danielle Jones here, is that they are doing the best they can with what they have available to them. Yes, mortality rates are high, but like I said, Charles Bell is treating men who are on a battlefield for 2 weeks after their injuries. It would be difficult for a surgeon now to save someone's life like that. And because I think we look at their medicine as being so kind of ineffective, we see it as being very cruel. We've painted this picture of them having to be cold-hearted because we have this idea of, you know, holding men down and chopping off a limb. And that's not really how the procedures worked historically. But I think we ascribe these feelings to them because for us in the modern day to comprehend it, that's how we have to see them acting. Because how could somebody who feels empathy and feels kindness and compassion want to do that to another human being, want to inflict that on another human being? But really what it comes down to with surgeons is that they just wanted to help. And the one thing I find really interesting about surgeons is that in the aftermath of battle, they didn't care what coat you had on. Surgeons were a neutral party. You could be American, you could be British, you could be Indigenous. They would help you because if you were injured and you needed help, that's all that mattered to them. And so I think that stereotype kind of came from our way of comprehending what we see as very violent and scary surgery, because we have to think of, well, why are men submitting to this? Why would they let them do these horrible surgeries? But surgery in this period is, you know, you will die without it, or you have a chance to live with it. So yeah, they're horrible, but you would undergo it because you wanted to live, and surgeons would do it because they wanted to help. So I think that's more of a modern stereotype than really what exists in the past. I did mention that there were some contemporary stereotypes, like the idea that they were untrained, or that they were maybe there was a stereotype that went around that that surgeons were paid for every limb that they amputated, but that wasn't true. That was a myth. So we do see that, and maybe there were, you know, unfortunate experiences soldiers had with surgeons, and a lot of the medical stuff we have left is coming from surgeons, so it's definitely biased. But like I said, I like to think that they realize that it's easier to just be kind, so why wouldn't they be?
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I always think about how we have chemotherapy now for people with cancer, and I think maybe in 150 years, whatever it is, they're going to look back and think it was absolutely
That's
barbaric.
exactly it. And I mean, you know, I'd like to remind us all that what we know about the human body is really only what we think we know. And tomorrow it could be entirely false. And we're always kind of working under that assumption, and they're doing the same thing. And, you know, in 200 years, what are they going to say about our medical treatment today? So it's a very interesting relationship that we have with medical doctors, especially because they hold so much control over our lives.
Yes, they do. All right, I don't see any other questions. So I guess that we will wrap up our talk. First and foremost, thank you, Kaitlyn, for this talk. I learned a lot. I enjoyed listening to it. We had some great questions at the end, and thank you for those who submitted that. As I said at the top of the hour, that this is the second talk of 3, and so we have one more next week, same time, same place, same Zoom link, just like before. And it's from Melissa Fowler, and her talk is Amputating Authority in the Environment of War, Practitioners' Agency During the War of 1812. So I hope to see you all there. This talk will be is recorded and will be posted. Was live on Facebook, so you can access it there if you want to rewatch anything, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel as well, if you want to share that with anyone. So thank you again, Kaitlyn. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday night.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Night, everyone.